CD 4.
At the hospital, an Anglican divine who had a church serving the British community of privateers, some of whom were as pious as they were bloodthirsty, came to say a special service for the wounded, and that was attended by the Barclays and Heinrich Lutyens, as well as a cynical Charlie Taverner, who would take salvation if it was going, and a more believing Rufus Dommett, who was, in truth, a simpler soul. The whole thing left John Pearce at a stand, for if he was not vehement in his disbelief, nor was he prepared to put it aside for the sake of appearances. He would neither attend the colourful Catholic ceremonies or those of what was High Anglican, meaning that when it came to the signing there was not a lot between them. He had to, in this, ignore Michael O'Hagan's worries for his soul, normally expressed in shakes of the head and a crossing, but more vocal in the face of the most important day in the Christian calendar. He had even managed to disappoint Horatio Nelson by declining his invitation to join him aboard HMS Agamemnon. The price of a fine dinner was too high. But that was only for one day. King George's navy loved to entertain, and so close to shore and a supply of food that was, if high-priced, fresh and available, with wine plentiful and cheap, they took advantage of it. On every vessel in the fleet over the festive week, every captain vied to throw a memorable feast, where they drank heartily, that before having themselves boated ashore to enjoy the delights of the port city. And it had to be said their behaviour was often questionable. The midshipmen were the worst, forever getting into scrapes with the locals, with indigenous knives produced to face visiting dirks, until Hood, fearing murder, confined them to their ships. But the officers, enjoying the taverns and the entertainments they provided, were not much better. John Pearce, unlike a high percentage of his fellow lieutenants and a fair number of captains, was not a man for whores, though he knew the difference between that estate and a courtesan of the kind he had come across in Paris. If their morality was not much dissimilar, their refinement and conversation was markedly dissimilar, the transaction being a cut above the merely carnal. But he took some amusement in observation, in seeing how the charming Italians fleeced with smiles their only too willing victims. On one occasion, leaving behind his uniform and wearing borrowed civilian clothes, he went out with his true friends to the part of the port occupied by the privateers, noting that the taverns they frequented were more like the Pelican in the way the visiting mariners had turned them into little pieces of their homeland. If the serving wenches had olive skin, they had the same shape as the rosies of this world. The men who teased and bedded them liked their women buxom, this to go with ale specially brewed by the locals to keep their customers content. Michael and Charlie drank copiously, and, in eyeing the people around them, picked out those few they might trust, as against the many they would not, responding to the suspicious stares they received from some true ruffians with an air of impertinence. They also took the opportunity to buy some female company with alacrity. Rufus, alternately blushing and boasting, sat with John Pearce for an age, until he was persuaded to an upstairs room by one of the girls, not knowing that it was Pearce who had prompted her to act. On rejoining them, he was the subject of much ribbing about losing his cherry, an accusation he vehemently denied, claiming, as all youth does, sexual conquests that were imagined. Also available were the official entertainments, balls and masques arranged by the Grand Duke's satraps for the visiting officers of an allied fleet, topped by performances at the opera, and that strange activity, to most of the British officers, of ballet. If they found the highly formalized dance slightly bewildering, there was no shortage of lieutenants waiting for the female performers at the stage door, lithe girls who were happy to be escorted to whatever gathering had been arranged for the evening, these at more respectable venues, where food, wine, and music were the staples. Any other activity was kept discreet. John Pearce had engaged with some of those dancers in stilted conversation, only to find that, outside the occupation they pursued, they had little or no conversation. something he had noted of the fraternity in Paris. Dancers talked of dancing, singers chatted about the operas in which they performed, actors, in which this city was lacking, at least told witty tales against themselves, or revelled in the humorous misfortunes of their peers. Livorno was not the centre of the Grand Ducal Court, that being Florence, leaving him to despair of ever finding women of sophistication. The grandest of the entertainments, thrown by an archbishop, was to prove him wrong. He was a man of secular tastes, and he quite obviously and openly supported a mistress. It was at the end of Christmas week when he threw his masked ball, this to see in the new year of 1794, and he was wealthy enough to outdo the local magnates in splendour. His palace was illuminated outside by hundreds of lanterns, inside by 1,000 candles, and it was clear the cream of Tuscan society found this a ball to attend. Hood and Hotham were both present, though never physically close, and, like the rest of their officers, in their best bib and tucker. But in the main they looked out of place, not in their dress, but in their rather stiff manner. They did not intermingle. Not for the first time as a naval officer, John Pearce found his facility in French his greatest advantage. The Gallic officers present were more at home in grand surroundings than their British counterparts, more inclined to engage with their Italian counterparts. So he sought out one he knew well, the Baron d'Ambert, and through him he was introduced to many of the leading citizens of Livorno, all of whom also spoke the international language of the world. And he met their companions, one of whom was the striking Contessa di Montenero. He had spotted her a lot earlier, and had noticed that her beauty, unlike most of her contemporaries, was unforced. High cheekbones, little powder to mask her luminous skin, smooth black eyebrows on a remarkably beautiful face, and, even from a distance, a ready and entrancing smile that often turned to an appealing laugh. Her clothing had about it a simplicity many lacked, merely because she had no need to seek to exaggerate in her dress and head decoration what was natural. There were no plumes and no colourful turban, leaving her countenance and manner as the things that conveyed her personality to the room. Naturally, with those attributes, she had been surrounded by gallants, but Pearce knew how to be patient, as well as how, by an amused stare, to convey his interest from afar. She had turned more than once, having noticed that gaze, to see if it was still upon her, giving a slow swish of her fan that somehow conveyed no displeasure. He had waited until the Baron d'Ambert, circulating the room and conversing, came into her orbit, before moving to join him. Introduced and close, he was pleased to see her skin was flawless, and that her eyes danced when she was in receipt of a compliment. The hardest part, following on from that, was to get her away from the babbling suitors who surrounded her, and that took a very deliberate showing of his back to them, done with such determination she laughed, displaying lovely teeth. "And how, Lieutenant, do you come to know the Baron so well?" "I had to negotiate with him for the surrender of Toulon." Those black eyebrows went up a fraction, and she could not help looking at his blue coat with its lack of adornment, denoting a lowly rank. "I have certain skills not vouchsafed to my superior officers." There were ways of saying those words, and he was pleased to see she took them in the way he intended, not boasting, yet leaving in the air the question as to what those skills might be. "An accomplished emissary, then?" "I like to think, Contessa, that my talents extend beyond mere negotiation." "You have a talent, monsieur, for being very forward." "I have found that little is gained by being overly cautious." "Sometimes all is lost by being too bold." "If I had any knowledge of what I might forfeit, I would know whether prudence was a course to follow." "Pearce!" He knew the voice. It was unmistakable, and he cursed Horatio Nelson, because the look in the Contessa's eyes as he made that last remark, if they did not promise, hinted at a distinct possibility of pleasure. John Pearce sensed the mores of this part of the world were the same as those he had known in Paris. This woman might be married, and no doubt her husband was in the same ballroom, but he would very likely be about his own affairs, leaving her to her own. Much as he wanted to ignore Nelson and to keep holding the gaze of the woman before him, he was obliged to turn. "Allow me to name you Madame Carlotti from the opera," Nelson boomed, before dropping his voice into what was supposed to be a manly exchange, hinting at something salacious, and underlining that while he was not drunk, he was close. "She has the most remarkable voice, which, sir, is not the least of her accomplishments. She also had the most remarkable bosom, that would have been extraordinary had it not sat on a body that was in proportion. Madame Carlotti was in all respects a big woman, a head taller than her companion, with an over-made-up face, eyes outlined in kohl and thick red lips, the very antithesis of the well-proportioned Contessa. "Do introduce me to this charming creature," Nelson added. "The Contessa di Montenero." The little captain took the Contessa's hand and kissed it, in a rather sloppy fashion, adding some compliments in barely comprehensible French. In leaning down, Pearce was presented with a trio of nervous lieutenants standing several feet back, who were watching Horatio Nelson with concern. "I see you travel with some of your officers," Pearce said, hoping that he would go to join them. "Ah, my guardian angels," Nelson joked. "They worry for my soul, but I've told them more than once a man is a bachelor east of Gibraltar." This amused Pearce, given Nelson, with his young face, blue eyes, and bright blonde hair, looked so virtuous, almost angelic. "You are not concerned that Madame Carlotti will discover you are a married man?" "Doesn't speak a word of English, you know, Pearce, which, while it has its advantages, can be damned awkward in a clinch. She speaks French, though, and since I have orders for Corsica, I'm thinking of asking her if she wants to come along." Pearce laughed out loud, which had the Italian opera singer looking at him suspiciously. The hint that he should pose the offer was too obvious. There was also the image of this pair having congress, this huge woman and Nelson. "Would Lord Hood approve?" "Shan't tell him." The band, which had been silent for an hour, struck up again with a lively rondo. Nelson's eyes lit up, and he swung round to his painted paramour and made all the signs requesting that they dance, which allowed Pearce to turn back to the Contessa, only to find her once more surrounded by eager suitors. "Forgive me, sir." He turned back to face another lieutenant, one of those Nelson had called his guardian angels. "I know you to be Mr. Pearce, and I wonder if I could count on your good offices." "And you are?" "Lieutenant Hinton, sir, at your service, Premier of HMS Agamemnon." "Looking out for your captain?" "Trying to. He seems to esteem you, and we must get Captain Nelson away from here before he commits a public indiscretion." Pearce had dined with Nelson once, in company, off Tunis, and noted he was light-headed in the article of drink. "From what I have seen, you need to keep him away from the punch-bowl." "I need to get him back to the ship." "And his opera singer?" "What happens in his private quarters is his affair. What happens in public view could become the object of gossip." "In letters home?" "The King's Navy is a small world, Mr. Pearce, and there are certain places where tales of misbehaviour would not play to his advantage." "Especially with his wife," Pearce thought. "He wants to take her to Corsica, Mr. Hinton." The eyebrows shot up. "Oh, were it not a court-martial offence, I would sandbag him and set sail while he was still unconscious." "Tell me, Mr. Hinton, is this association with Madame Carlotti an aberration?" "It is not his first adventure, sir." "And how to the end?" "With much remorse." "Then I fear you will be wasting your time, sir. A man who displays remorse, then goes on to commit the same sin, is a lost cause." Pearce looked over to where the Contessa stood, still surrounded, but she glanced in his direction at the same time and smiled, making him determined to end this conversation. The doings of Horatio Nelson and the effect it would have on his marriage were none of his affair. He had better fish to fry, and he was sure that little persuasion would be required for him to make this a memorable night. Perhaps my original advice was mistaken. The best thing you can do is to get him so drunk he must depart this place. Either that or get Lord Hood to order him back to his ship. It was an irony too far that in the letters home to England from Italy in January of 1794, the incident that most amused or scandalized the correspondence was not the antics of Captain Horatio Nelson and an Italian opera singer, but the tale of a certain Lieutenant John Pearce being caught in flagrante with the Tuscan Contessa in her bedchamber, not by her husband, but by her present irate lover. This fellow, a minor nobleman of tender years, besotted with the lady, took the precaution of turning up with a trio of his retainers, brutes bearing clubs, forcing an unarmed Pearce to leap from a first-floor window with his breeches in one hand, leaving behind his blue uniform coat and hat. Needless to say, his arrival back at the hospital sans clothing required some explanation, a tale he told of robbery, which was quite blown when the truth was the talk of Livorno the following day, given the Contessa's young lover, distantly related it seemed to the Grand Duke, wanted it known that he intended, once the culprit had been identified, to challenge him to a duel. "You will do nothing of the sort," said Lord Hood, when Pearce intimated his desire to accept. "The last things we need are strange relations with the locals, which we will most certainly have if you skewer some callow, love-struck youth who has imperial blood in his veins." "He might do that to me, my lord." "Don't get me excited by the prospect," the older man hooted. "The letter, Parker." "HMS Grampus is bound for home, and you are to sail on her," Parker said, handing him an oilskin pouch. "I suggest it would be best if you repair aboard her at once." "And stay there until she weighs," Hood added. HMS Grampus, a two-decker of 50 guns, looked perfectly fine from a distance, but in coming close John Pearce could see the thickness of the paintwork at the places where it had peeled, which argued that her scantlings were not as sound as they first appeared. In his newly acquired broadcloth coat pocket, the property of an officer who had expired fighting at Toulon, he had the communications handed to him by Admiral Parker. On his head was a replacement hat, and his feet rested by his sea-chest. While looking at him, and trying to conceal their smiles, were Michael, Charlie, and Rufus Dommett. He soon discovered that Lord Hood had stripped the vessel of every seaman she could spare, leaving her perilously short of hands should she be required to both work the sails and fight the guns. But his whole fleet was like that, with the men the Admiral had originally fetched out from England, as well as suffering from the normal rate of losses, having suffered casualties at Toulon. What remained had to be spread through the captured vessels taken from the French. The ship did not weigh immediately, leading to a frustrating few days, which saw HMS Agamemnon raise her anchor and depart, with Pearce wondering if Madame Carlatti was aboard. Somehow he doubted it. Freed from the illusions brought on by too much wine, surely Nelson would see such an idea as what it was — madness. Pearce was not competent to inspect the ship, but even he knew by the smell of rot that she was in a poor state, and in a conversation with the carpenter he was made well aware of her manifest problems. Scantlings that worked enough to let in water in any kind of sea, buttocks so rotten that the man could poke a finger into the wood fibres, masts that were far from proper in their seating, while he was in despair about her hanging knees. "She will get us home, I hope." The carpenter shrugged, showing that fatalism which was necessary in a wooden ship at sea, the attitude that said any man's fate was in the lap of the gods. "Got us here, Your Honour, and she weren't fit for it when we weighed from the Nore. Sparky's like this and float better than most folk think. Long as we don't get a true hurricano, I'd say she'll get us home, even with only half our true complement of hands. And then, state she's in, they'll break her up, I reckon, and I shall be on the hunt for a new berth. With luck, I'll get a warrant on a 74. The sight of Ralph and Mrs. Barclay coming aboard, with Devonogh and Cornelius Gerson in tow, was not one to cheer John Pearce much. Yet there was nothing he could do about it. To protest to lordhood would only expose him to ridicule, and besides, when would there be another ship heading home? Heinrich Lutyens came aboard too, having volunteered to replace the surgeon of HMS Grampus, who was unwell, causing Michael O'Hagan to opine, and not entirely with a degree of wicked pleasure, that it was just like old times. The fact that Barclay glared at him when he espied him did not bother John Pearce, except that the prospect of spending several weeks in close proximity did not appeal. That, and the fact soon made plain that Barclay and Captain Dawes of the Grampus were old shipmates, boded ill. But Emily Barclay would not catch his eye, and that was wounding. Clearly she had heard of his nocturnal, carnal exploits, and she was no doubt shocked by his behaviour. The crew were not, and neither were his pelicans. It was obvious everyone had heard the tale. Pearce could not walk the deck without the men nudging each other and grinning. The morning came when their number was raised at the masthead of HMS Victory, and the signal guns spoke out to ensure the order was observed. Under a sky as grey as that with which he had arrived in Livorno, HMS Grampus weighed anchor with all the usual stamping on the capstan, as it was used to haul in the great anchor cable, the nippers running hard to attach lines as the wet, slimy rope was taken to the bitts to be laid end on end. Pearce was on deck when the anchor, with Grampus running over it, was plucked free to be fished in and catted, watching with interest the topmen letting go of the sails as ordered by the ship's master, seeing them sheeted home by the men on deck. It all went very smoothly, as it should under the eye of several admirals, a whole host of foreigners looking out from the shore, and on a ship which, having been in service for months, was well worked up. Ominously there was another sound, that of the pumps already fully operational to keep the bilges clear of water, even before they had cleared inshore waters. Chapter 10. The Mediterranean could be troubled at any time of year, surrounded as it was by the various land masses that produced hot, cold, and disturbed air, leading to violent storms as bad as anything that could be produced by the Atlantic Ocean, and HMS Grampus sailed straight into one. Fortunately, in both Captain Dawes and the master, Mr. Loudon, they had experienced seamen who knew the beast in which they were about to be caught. The first intimation of the approach for John Pearce was the way the ship was being prepared. Hatches battened down, oiled canvas covers being spread over the companionways, the deck coops being struck below, along with anything movable, such as the cabin and wardroom furniture, while extra lashings were put upon the ship's cannon and the boats sitting above the waist. Instructions had also been sent from the deck to secure the cots of the wounded, and transfer to hammocks those who could rest in them. On deck, although the sky was a brassy hue, there was little to see. The water was certainly choppy, a vicious cross-sea which made the ship shudder and groan. But it had been like that since the previous day, and when he approached Captain Dawes it was to find a man anxiously searching the horizon, the master behind doing likewise. They had spoken little previously, he not seeming the sociable type, but Pearce had taken the precaution of telling him, once Barclay came aboard, that there was bad blood between them, and should he be tempted to bring them together, it would be best to avoid that. He did not interrupt a discussion about the amount of sea-room the ship had, listening as the two men discussed the various options, depending on the direction of wind, the strength of the tempest, the distance between their present position and Corsica, as well as some outcrop called Gorgona that was apparently a speck of an island, the tip of an extinct volcano, that stuck up out of the ocean in the deep part of the Gulf of Genoa. "You anticipate a blow, sir?" he asked, as the master disappeared into his hutch and his charts. "I do, Mr. Pearce, and I would advise you it will be an unpleasant one. Look at the sky and feel the heaviness in the air." "From where will it come?" "Too early to tell. The wind, you will have noticed, though slight, keeps shifting." It was in conversations like these that John Pearce felt most acutely his lack of knowledge. People like the naval officer had been at sea for more than 3 decades, and had seen all there was to see, as well as benefiting from the shared knowledge of the profession. The Navy was its own academy, in which education was part experience and part instruction, and that was an institution in which he was an outsider. For all that, Pearce was a naturally curious fellow, and not one to ignore the acquisition of free knowledge. "Whatever, Mr. Pearce, when it comes, I suspect it will do so suddenly, and be upon us with some speed." "Hence the preparations?" "Yes. And before you ask if I might be wrong, that possibility does exist, but it is not wise, as I'm sure you agree, to tempt Providence." As if ordered, the sky to the north was suddenly suffused with lightning. No forks, just a flash of brighter light that raced across the clouded sky. Pearce noticed Dawes counting off the seconds on his fingers, waiting for the rumble of thunder, which came, deep and long, after about 20 of those. "Now, Mr. Pearce, we at least know from where we are threatened, and we await the next sign." On deck, all activity had ceased. The captain was not the only one wishing to measure the speed of the approaching tempest, and they did not have long to wait. The next flash of lightning was much brighter, and the thunder came in half the time, which had the master moving forward, speaking trumpet in hand. "I would advise, sir, we go down to close-reefed topsails immediately." "Make it so, Mr. Loudon, and I would suggest that you, like me, send for your oilskins." The sky to the northeast, where it met the sea, was turning from brassy grey to black, and for the first time the lightning forked into the sea, a bright flash that made Pearce blink. Like most people, weather fascinated him, and he had seen many storms in his time, from the shore, from the top of hills, and had them come upon him when far from any shelter. Even he knew this one was exceptional. "Can I be of any service, sir?" "I would imagine, Mr. Pearce, that the pumps will require every available pair of hands. If you do not mind supervising that, I will be grateful, as my officers, I think, will likely be otherwise engaged." "Sir, I shall shed my coat and pump myself." That shocked Dawes, who was putting on his foul-weather gear. "I would hope, sir, you would remember your dignity as an officer." There was no point in saying he had none of that. He moved out of the way as the topmen were called aloft to take in the courses and double-reef the topsails. Other men were rigging extra lines, man-ropes along the bulwarks, hawsers to the masts, fore and backstays to take the strain that was bound to be put upon them, and he was vaguely aware that the ship was turning slowly away from the oncoming storm. When it struck, Dawes clearly intended to run before it. He went below, calling on his friends as well as Devereux, leading them to where the pumps were already manned. They never ceased to work on this vessel as the timbers moved and leaked, but they would have to be employed at a harder rate if they were going to ship water over the deck. No amount of precautions could keep a goodly amount of that from making its way down through the decks to the bilges where, if it became too deep, it would affect the ability of the ship to manoeuvre, given it would sit lower in the water than hitherto. A carpenter's mate was already there, measuring the water in the well, which, as time passed, would tell them if their efforts were holding it steady or, more worryingly, whether the depth of the bilge was rising. While on both sides of the dome pump casing, men were working the crank handles in a desultory fashion, something which Pearce wanted changed right away on the very sound principle it was better to be ahead of the game than merely level. "You don't want to go too hard at it," said the carpenter's mate. "There'll be all manner of muck down there, and if the pump picks it up and gets jammed, it will not do us no good. We's at 3 feet in the well now, and that we can live with." Here he was again, faced with superior knowledge, and being told something he should have known. "Time to start going hard at it, Your Honour, is when it begins to rise, and not afore." "You have ridden out heavy seas and storms already, yes?" "We have, sir." "How bad has it been before?" "Bad," the man replied. "You'd best get teams of men ready, because if this is like what is being said, there'll be hands expiring from the effort." The crack of thunder was loud enough to penetrate the overhead deck planking, and above their heads, Captain Dawes was watching the bolts of lightning strike the sea all around the ship, none of which was visible to Pearce, given the gun ports were tightly shut and secured. But he did notice the timbers were creaking more noisily, and felt the increased motion of the ship as the stern lifted higher than hitherto, causing Heinrich Lutyens, who had been walking towards them carrying the case with his surgical instruments, to break into a sudden scurry that John Pearce halted with an outstretched hand. Behind him, Emily Barclay, dressed in an apron, was hanging on to an upright. "The captain has said we must set up in the cockpit to treat injuries," Lutyens said. "It'll be splints you'll need, Heinrich, for broken bones," Pearce said, moving towards Emily Barclay, where, upon reaching her, he held out his hand. "Let me assist you." "No, thank you. I would rather manage on my own." It was more the face and the way it was slightly turned away from him, nose in the air, that told John Pearce why she was being aloof. Clearly she had heard of his nocturnal escapades. Who had not? And was offended to be offered aid from such a tainted source. If he had known how her husband had exploited that to make her feel uncomfortable, he would have been made angry instead of amused. On more than one occasion she had stood up to him on behalf of John Pearce, and now that was being thrown back in her face at every opportunity. "You may take it, Mrs. Barclay, that I am cleansed of my adventures." "I do not know, sir, how anyone can merely wash away such disgrace." "What you term disgrace, madam, I would name as pleasure." In receipt of a loud sniff, Pearce added, "You should not allow the fact that such a thing has been denied to you to cloud your opinions." The look that got, aimed at him as she staggered on to follow Lutyens, was icy indeed. Something Michael O'Hagan, working without too much effort at the crank handle of the pump, could not fail to notice. And since he was close enough to talk softly, in any event the creaking of the ship covering his words, he did so in a friendly voice. "There you go now, John boy, upsetting yet another lady." Pearce grinned. "What makes you think I upset the Contessa, Michael?" "Sure you'll be telling me next you left her smiling." "Laughing, Michael, not smiling." "Jesus, were you that poor? Mind, if the sight of you leaping through a window in your smalls did not make a body laugh, they would be a miserable soul." The stern lifted even higher as a larger wave swept under the counter. "A bit more effort on the pumps, Michael." That got him a huge grin. "I could say the same to you, John boy, and if you'd be after some instruction, I would be willing to show you—" That was not finished, because the ship suddenly lifted and listed as it was hit by a screaming wind, sending anyone not with a secure hold tumbling. Pearce only stayed upright because Michael took one hand off the crank to grab him, his arm fully extended before he was brought to a halt. Then the water started to pour down the companionways. Not the full amount, that was held back by the covers, but enough to be visible. More squeezing its way, driven by the wind, through the gap where the gun ports sat against the hull. From then on it was like slowly riding a bucking horse, and one that was capable of moving in surprising directions to catch the unwary off guard. HMS Grampus lifted, dropped, swayed, listed for an age, before righting itself. And all the while the amount of sea-water she was making increased, and this with the pumps now working flat out, the carpenter's mate, when he could steady himself enough to take a reading, letting Pearce know the water in the well was rising by the foot. On deck, the captain and the master, peering through spume-blasted eyes, gave shouted instructions to the quartermaster and his mates who were lashed to the wheel, seeking to keep the bowsprit, which kept trying to sweep right or left, pointed dead away from the screaming wind, a task made harder as the rudder was being continually lifted free of the water. There was no sky above their heads, just pounding rain sheeting forward to meet the sea shipping over the bulwarks, as Grampus was driven under by the head, and by now they were propelled by nothing but a main storm staysail, with men aloft seeking to gather in the reefed topsails and lash them tight to the yards. The storm was still raging as night fell. Not that they had enjoyed much daylight while the sun was still above the heavy clouds. And darkness was added to the nightmare of an existence confined to less than the hand in front of your face. Below there were now 10 men working the pumps, Pearce amongst them, while another party of the same number sought to recover from their exertions before being called back to duty on the crank handles. And still the water rose in the well, which, if it endangered them long-term, acted as a form of extra ballast to steady the ship, making it lower in the water. If the wind eventually moderated, the sea did not, a scudding swell that tossed HMS Grampus around like a sodden cork. Men, including one of Dawes' youngest midshipmen, had been washed overboard into a sea from which rescue was impossible. If they could be heard screaming, it was not for long, and they could not be seen. In the cockpit, Heinrich Lutjens and Emily Barclay treated a steady stream of deep cuts and bruises, as well as broken bones caused by falls, and men being thrown against hard wood, despite their best efforts to hang on to ropes or netting. Pearce, working flat out, was vaguely aware of the seams opening up in the main deck planking before closing again, and a peculiar deep groan as the ship sailed atop a wave before plunging back down again, the whole weight of the vessel thrown onto the central section of the hull, leaving both bow and stern in the air as deadweight. Dawes was aware of it too, but in no position to do anything about it. Ships had fallen apart at sea before, he was sure. In some cases there had been survivors to tell the tale of a broken-backed hull. If his command were going to do that, it would not cease for his silent prayers. The night was hell. Endless darkness, movement, noise, and toil, till it felt as though the attempt to stay afloat and whole could founder on sheer exhaustion. John Pearce, struggling to keep up, could only admire Michael O'Hagan and Devereux, the two most stalwart men on those crank handles, keeping going while others fell into a state of collapse around them, needing to be dragged clear so another, still trying to recover from his last bout, was drawn in as a replacement. Rufus Dommett was lying in a crumpled heap, utterly done, while Charlie tried gamely to take his turn, proving that whatever else he had gained from being pressed, he was a stronger creature now than he had been on the banks of the Thames. Ralph Barclay lay in his cot, hanging from triangular ropes from the overhead beam, still, while the ship swung around him, listening, for that was all he could do, to the sounds around him, the timbers creaking, then cracking as the strain became too great. And that included the panic-stricken cries of his clerk, which over time had changed to low moaning. There was nothing to be done. If it was time to meet his Maker, so be it. Mid-morning saw a clearer sky, but off the larboard quarter lay land, and quite soon the sight of heavy seas breaking on rocks. It was that damned outcrop of Gorgona, the peak of the tree-covered island rising over 700 feet in the air, doubly dangerous as a lee shore for having high cliffs and deep water all around, with few places where dropping an anchor would find holding ground. Tired as the men on board were, they had to be summoned on deck, the top men to go aloft and get some more way on the ship, for to keep just running before the wind was to founder by being driven onto the faces of those cliffs. That took men off the pumps, meaning those remaining had to work harder, and if the alternative had not been to drown, John Pearce was unsure he could have continued. But he must, and now it was necessary to try to keep the level of water in the well, now near to flooding the lower deck, at bay, for a ship sluggish to steer was a danger, not an asset. The course Dawes needed to steer did not need to alter by much to avoid an island 1.5 miles wide. Still, it was touch and go, for to hoist more sail was to strain masts he knew to be far from secure, and if one of them went by the board, the ship would be doomed. If anything, it was the precautions he had taken which made possible the change of course. those extra hawsers attached to the fore and mainmast which held them, creaking and protesting, as well as moving alarmingly as the wind pressed on the loosened topsails, now sheeted home and taut. They passed so close to Gorgona they could hear the waves breaking, but once clear of that, and with ample sea room, Dawes could ease the strain and let the ship run on the swell. Finally, even that subsided enough to make pumping the most strenuous and necessary task, with every man on board taking his turn, as those who had laboured through the night lay either asleep or wondering how muscles could ache so much. Arms, thighs, and backs. Pearce dragged himself back on deck to find a quarterdeck full of men with red-rimmed eyes and strained faces who looked in need of much rest, but could as yet not risk it. But the time came when things eased enough to allow some respite. HMS Grampus, still dipping and swaying on the falling swell, could begin to put to rights all that had gone wrong, and call a muster to find out who was missing. The ship was a sorry sight, with various loose ropes and blocks swinging in the wind, including some of those hawsers rigged as extra preventer stays, sails that had blown out, one of the yards having parted from its slings, and in many places cleats that had been ripped off the shrouds. John Pearce was reminded of two things: that if a wooden sailing ship was a construct of shaped timbers, much of it only functioned because it was held together or operated by ropes, many of which he as yet did not know the names of, or if he did, struggled with the complexity of recalling which was which. "Mr. Pearce, I would be grateful if you would take charge of the party on the bowsprit and spritsail yards," shouted Captain Dawes. "You will not be aware, but 2 of my lieutenants are among the injured. Mr. Lutyens is attending to one collarbone, and my Premier has a badly broken ankle." There was no option but to say yes, but it was an operation very much undertaken using the knowledge of the hands he had under his command, the men aboard rated able. Rigging had to be cut away and replaced, and that meant intricate knots and rope work that was way beyond his competence. What was not parted had to be checked for damage that might weaken it in the future, and that included the myriad lines of the running rigging which ran back to various points on the foremast, the hull, and the knightheads. For men already weary, it was hard going, but there was no room for complaint. Every man jack aboard Grampus was suffering likewise. Sails had been taken out of the locker and were being prepared for hoisting aloft as replacements for those damaged, and that meant work on the capstan to get the heavy canvas raised, and toil for the worn-out topmen on the yards, men who had already had to replace slings and rigging, this while the ship dipped and swayed on the swell. But more cheerful was the fact that the cook had got his coppers lit, and there was not only hot water for the surgeon, but men employed bringing up the casks of pork and beef that would provide a hot meal for officers and men alike. Then one watch could go to their hammocks and sleep, that followed by the next. Within 24 hours it was, if you could forgive the even noisier creaks of the working timbers, as though the storm through which they had just laboured was no more than a bad dream. Chapter 11. If the Mediterranean could be cruel, it could also delightfully surprise on a mid-January day, with sunshine aided by a warm southerly breeze coming off the North African coast that made for a pleasant interlude. Pearce was on the deck, pacing back and forth, having attended divine service, really just a homily produced by the ship's captain. Several of the recovering wounded, now including those who had suffered in the recent storm, had either come or been brought up to enjoy the air, and given they were sailing easy on that breeze, the crew were occupied in making, mending, and prettying themselves for a hoped-for run ashore in Gibraltar. Michael, Rufus, and Charlie were with some of the Hinslip's crew, jawing away while they tended to each other's pigtails, the sight of which, even if they had become familiar on the heads of his fellow pelicans, made Pearce stop and think. He could not recall their growing to the length they had. These standard accoutrements of the British tar had just seemed to appear naturally, but it did force upon him an unwanted thought. What in the name of the devil were they all going to do once they got back to England? Michael could go back to his old life of digging ditches and foundations for the spate of speculative building which afflicted the capital city. What about Rufus and Charlie, who would certainly still have warrants out for their arrest? They would not have lapsed, though their absence might have seen others replace them in the minds of the tipstaffs, whose job it was to apprehend felons, and the kind of low culls looking for a bounty. Yet looking at them now, they were every inch the sailor. And him, what had he become? While still fully aware of the level of his ignorance, he also knew that in merely being aboard a ship he had absorbed a great deal. From barely knowing the bow from the stern of a naval vessel, he was now conversant with many aspects of the way a ship was built, rigged, and how it was run. He also had to admit that he had found leadership in tight situations something to savour, and Michael O'Hagan had more than once referred to his seeming love of danger. Was he just a thrill-seeker, or did he actually enjoy combat? There were also the things he did not enjoy: deference to authority, the loss of freedom inherent in a hierarchical service. Yet that same service had fed his need for independence as often as it had obliged him to act on the instructions of others, and had given him an insight into his own character, not always a view that presented unmitigated pleasure. Could he return to a life without adventure? Could he, with the few obvious skills he had, find an occupation that would afford him that which he had experienced since being pressed? Sustained, as he had been, by the need to fulfill a promise to his friends, they were now on their way to liberty, the freedom to decide for themselves what they would do and where they would go, and it was very possible that, gifted that, they would each proceed in their own direction, never to meet again. There would be no more pelicans. Certainly he had to deliver Hood's letters, and then seek to bring a case against Ralph Barclay, something which may take years. But he also had to live, and without some kind of paid occupation that would be difficult. Looking at his companions again, he so much wanted to just go up and ask them if they had a plan. But that was not possible. Much as he saw them as his friends, there was a gulf between them now, caused by his rank, a thing they might ignore privately, but also something they must publicly acknowledge. To ask them now would be to discomfort them. Turning away, he was presented with the sight of Barclay coming on deck, the ever-faithful Devereux at his heels, one hand always ready to steady his captain, though the man was becoming more accustomed now to not having his left arm. He was not cured. That would take a lot more time, months, not weeks. But his face looked more settled, less lined with pain, evidence that the thing was on the mend. The eyes moved in his direction, but just as swiftly Barclay looked away again. This as Cornelius Gerson came on deck as well, he too taking care to avoid any eye contact. It was not just he and Barclay who avoided meeting his eye. In the last weeks Emily Barclay continued to avoid him, and that was less easy to accept. Though he knew her parochial upbringing was to blame for her being standoffish, he was far from suffering any feelings of guilt. And besides, anyone who had agreed to marry a scrub like Ralph Barclay, albeit she was young and naive, showed a startling want of judgment. Though there was not much in years between them, he knew he was very different, and nothing underlined that more than his attitude to dalliance. Ever since he had come to manhood, John Pearce had been forward with women. Too much so, probably, for English mores. But then he had come into the bloom of ardent youth as a tall, fine-looking youth in Paris, and at a time when the famous laxity of the French towards fidelity had eased even more, thanks to the overthrow of absolute monarchical power. He had been seduced by women of experience, then gone on to enjoy the favours of a beautiful mistress without in any way troubling her wealthy husband. He, too, had his liaisons. That had been a golden time, when the whole city had seemed permanently en fête, the time before the purists, opportunists, and demagogues of the Revolution had turned it into the bloodbath it had become, when the leaders of the National Assembly had been men of wit and intelligence, instead of purveyors of dogma and spite. His reputation having preceded him, his polemics against monarchy and privilege translated from the English, Adam Pearce had been welcomed like a long-lost brother, lauded for his views, his stand, and his imprisonment. That changed when the power shifted to men who were no more prepared to be termed as wrong-headed than any crowned king. He had known for a long time that his upbringing had fitted him for nothing, and he certainly had no desire to follow in his father's footsteps. Much as he loved him, much as there had been a time when he quite naturally agreed with everything Adam Pearce believed, such blind faith had not survived his coming of age. Long before the flight to Paris, he had begun to question the tenets by which he had been raised, and his experiences there had done much to increase his doubts. A short stay in Fleet Prison had exposed him to the dregs of humanity, as well as society's victims, that in itself enough to cause any scales to fall from his eyes. In Paris he had seen a rampaging mob, egged on by firebrand orators of the likes of Marat, hack to death people whose only crime was to have been born into privilege. The question of whether they were good people or bad was not posed. And finally he had visited the conciergerie, where his ailing father was a prisoner, had seen how those who had once had much were reduced to beggary by a vindictive revolution, had witnessed his own father die at the hands of that same body of odious extremists. John Pearce shook his head sharply then. These were not thoughts on which he wished to dwell, and he sought instead to take pleasure from the bright sky and blue sea. His promenading had brought him near to the quarter-deck, so to keep his mind free of memories, and seeing Captain Dawes had come on deck, a man with whom, given he was messing in the wardroom, he had exchanged few words since coming aboard, he moved closer to attempt some naval conversation. "Do you think, sir, this wind will be enough to get us into Gibraltar?" The response was a cold look, as if to address him so was extreme temerity. "I ask only out of curiosity, sir, given I know with the strong tidal flow from the Atlantic it is not an easy approach from the east." "Time will tell." No courtesy, no Mr. Pearce or Sir, and in essence no answer, which was damned rude, and not something John Pearce was inclined to accept. "I'm sorry if my inquiry offends you, sir." "Offends? I wonder if you know the meaning of the word. I had the pleasure of Captain Barclay's company at dinner last night, given he is now well enough to be a guest, and he was most informative regarding your background." "There are, sir, two sides to every tale." "Are you suggesting I mistrust the word of a man I have known for years, and indeed shared a wardroom with in the early years of the American War, not to mention an officer who has given an arm for his country? Well, I once saw your escapade in Livorno was amusing. I now know it is indicative of your character." "I am sure his arm will heal in time," Pearce said, guessing at the nature of the conversation. "I doubt, however, his malice will." "Might I remind you that you were talking about a superior officer?" "If not a superior person, Captain Dawes," Pearce snapped. "Might I ask, was his wife with him?" The reply was equally sharp. "I don't see that as any of your affair, sir." "Then I take it she was not, though I also do not doubt you invited her." "Perhaps when Captain Barclay is maligning me the next time, you should have her present and see if his story is altered." "You presume to tell me who I should have at my table?" "I presume to tell you, Captain Dawes, once more, that there are two sides to every tale." Pearce had to stop himself then. To blurt out about the notion of perjury would be unwise. Besides, given the look on the face of the ship's captain, it would not have altered his opinion one iota. "You will not presume on my quarter-deck, which you will oblige me by vacating." "I will do so willingly, since I am beginning to think that being elevated to post-rank deprives a man of judgment when it ought to aid him." Dawes actually sneered. "The kind of judgment that sees a fellow running through the streets in his flapping shirt, perhaps. Better that, sir, than take the common route to naval gratification, which is through the whorehouse or the mid's berth." Dawes puffed up to blast him, but Pearce was already gone, making for the waist, running into Heinrich Lutyens, who had been close enough to overhear the conversation, as had half the people on the ship, given it had started normally, but moved on to become noisily acrimonious. "Such a talent for making enemies, John. I have never seen or heard the like. When one is surrounded by fools. You are angry that Captain Berkeley has damned you to a stranger? I care nothing for what he says about me." "Which flies in the face of what you have just done, brother. You care deeply, and so you should, but neither should you be surprised. Just let me get to London with the evidence I have, and we will see Ralph Berkeley in no position to blacken anyone, me included, lest it be the jailer who holds the key to the perjuring bastard's cell." It was only because Cornelius Gerson stopped that John Pearce spotted him. The deck was, after all, quite busy with people moving about, and it was clear by the look on his face he had overheard the words just used. A stare that was part a question as to what was meant. Then he looked away and walked past Pearce and Lutyens before disappearing down a companionway with Lutyens' eyes on his back. "I take it you mean your intention to see Captain Berkeley arraigned for perjury?" "Yes." "Then I would advise you not to speak of it, even to me. I have never known a place like a ship where it is so difficult to keep a secret." Going below to the wardroom, Pearce knew as soon as he entered that the atmosphere had changed. Not one of those present would look at him, which included the lieutenant with his arm in a sling and the Premier whose bandaged and splintered leg was resting on a chair. Hitherto things had been easy. He had been ribbed about his exploits in the bedchamber, not without a hint of jealousy for his good fortune, and it had in all respects been like any other wardroom where, even if there was dislike, it was well hidden by good manners. Not now, obviously, and such a change could only have come from the captain. What had Berkeley said about him? Was it just the truth of his distaste, supported by malevolence, or had he invented some tale to further blacken his name? The one thing which was certain was that he could not inquire, but he was damned if he was going to be discomfited by these fellows, so supine in their attitude to their superior that they eschewed any independence of mind. "I'm looking forward to Gibraltar, as I'm sure you are too," he said gaily. "We must all take a run ashore together, we being such boon companions." The response was a series of coughs and splutters. Cornelius Gerson was sitting on a sea chest in a screened-off cabin, lit only by a tallow wad guttering in a lantern, wondering at the import of what he had overheard. Having been a witness at Ralph Berkeley's court-martial, as well as partaking in the discussions that had preceded it, he knew very well what a charade it had been, nothing more than a pretence set up and designed to exonerate him. Of all the witnesses who had spoken, he had told the fewest lies, or if he had mouthed untruths, they had been of a nature difficult to challenge either then or in the future, being impressions or recollections of one-to-one conversations. But he knew to what degree others had perjured themselves. Berkeley himself had been wise enough to decline to say anything other than to accept his responsibilities as the captain of HMS Brilliant. Whatever others had done, mistakenly or not, his commission meant the blame lay with him. It had been a telling defence, more likely prompted by the fear that his wife, being present, might blurt out that he was a liar, though there was some risk in his acceptance that the testimony of others had been truthful. The real danger to Berkeley's position did not lie with either of them, but with the other witnesses. Yet the only one journeying back to England with them was Devereux, and he would cut out his tongue rather than let down a man he seemed to venerate. Toby Burns, the true weak spot, the one who could sink them all and would do so were he ever put in a witness box, was still in Leghorn, as was the only other witness, a rat-faced one-time boatswain's mate called Kemp. Yet Pearce had spoken with confidence, and that had to have some basis. Mulling over the possibilities, he would have said from his experience that to bring a case against the captain was not only foolhardy, it would be expensive and futile, unless... Did Pearce have something apart from his companions, his stupidly named pelicans, to support an accusation? They were hardly a threat. A known felon, a stripling of a boy run from his apprenticeship, and a fellow of large frame and limited intelligence, an Irishman, not a race to be given too much credence in an English court. Self-centred in the extreme, though he would not have admitted it, Cornelius Gerson's underlying concern was not for Ralph Barclay, but for himself. He had attached himself to the man because being a clerk, a position for which he was admirably fitted, was a damn sight better than serving on the lower deck. If John Pearce had railed against being pressed into the Navy, he had not been more vociferous in his objections than the man now contemplating his own future. Gerson hated the smells, the filth, the ignorance of those he was obliged to mess with, and being ordered about by blue-coated fools as much as anyone. He was a man who had enjoyed comfort, and yearned for nothing more than to return to that. The warm fires in good houses, with simple and compliant young wives, wedded to older, busy men who required an assiduous clerk to oversee their personal affairs, too occupied to see that some of their hard-earned money was being siphoned off to their willing bookkeeper. That had been his life. He had had the benefit of good clothes, a full purse, usually wise enough to move on before matters reached the crisis of discovery. Only he had been caught out, and that had led him to this place. He rarely thought about being chucked off London Bridge, it being such an unpleasant recollection. But he did so now. He could see the faces of the grinning toughs employed by Alderman Denby Carruthers, feel their hands as they first stripped him of his good clothes before lifting him bodily over the parapet, the sickening feeling in the pit of his belly as he fell, and the icy-cold shock of landing in the waters of the River Thames. He harboured no gratitude for the hand of the man in the boat, HMS Brilliant's master-at-arms, who had grabbed his collar and saved his life. Taken aboard the frigate, he was pressed like the others, low-life types whom he would have spat on in his previous life. His protests that he was a gentleman and thus outside the scope of the press-gang had founded on the fact that he was dressed in nothing but a shirt. Indeed, his contention had provoked laughter, leaving him humiliated. Somehow, in his convoluted thinking, he managed to drag an image of John Pearce into that, so that all the hate he felt was fixed upon him. He and Pearce had clashed quickly, the man being an unctuous prig who saw himself as superior in every way, when he was naught but a jumped-up nobody, and that dislike had done nothing but deepen with the passing of time and acquaintance. "He must know he cannot bring a case without evidence," he said softly to himself. "Ergo he must, as he so plainly said, have evidence." Ralph Barclay would get another ship, probably one a great deal larger than HMS Brilliant. The opportunities for peculation were high in the King's Navy, and one asset Barclay had was his lack of any false morality. He was as prepared to pilfer as any man should be, this as long as it was carefully done, and in Cornelius Gerson he had a man of some expertise. It was Gerson who had set up the removal of goods from the Toulon stores, he who had dealt with the various French officials, trading valuable commodities for a promise of evacuation. Yet it would have been pointless without Ralph Barclay. Only he could sanction and cover the use of the ship's holds to store the purloined goods. If that enterprise had ultimately failed to produce a profit, he was sure there would be others. That was why he had stuck with the man. He did not like him much, but that mattered less than his prospects. He was in the top third of the captain's list during a war that could last for years. Commanding a ship, he could line both their pockets, and should time allow him to advance to the rank of Commodore or Admiral, the sky was the limit. As for life in the Navy, if it had its unpleasant side, Gerson could live with that, given he had no idea if life ashore was still dangerous. If the man he had robbed and cuckolded found out he had survived, he might seek to dispose of him a second time.
End of CD 4. CD 5.
Gerson had to force his mind away from pleasant speculations of future wealth onto the present problem, how to confound John Pearce, if indeed he needed to be confounded. He needed to know what he had, or indeed if he had anything at all. and there was no point in asking the principal. What he needed was a weak link. Charlie Taverner and he shared the mutual loathing of two peas from the same pod, while nothing would be gained by seeking information from that brute O'Hagan. But Rufus Dommett was young and something of an idiot. He might reveal things supposed to be secret and not even know he was doing so. One other thing Gerson had to do must be acted upon right away. He must apprise Ralph Barclay of the possibility of the threat. Heinrich Lutchins was amused by the way Emily Barclay had repeatedly described John Pearce's behaviour in Livorno as reprehensible. Not endlessly, but somehow the subject had been alluded to more often than it should, given there was no connection between them other than social contact. Odd that all her troubles with her husband, though they had been deepened by his behaviour, had begun with her defence of the very same fellow. Perhaps that was why she felt she could refer to him in such a proprietary way. Whatever excuse Ralph Barclay had come up with to flog John Pearce, it had been more to do with the familiar way the man addressed his wife than for any offence listed in the Articles of War, and Emily had made her displeasure at his actions as plain to him as had the crew of the frigate. The whole affair had hurt Barclay much more than his supposed victim. But it was really the court-martial, which she had attended even though she had been forbidden to do so, which had ripped a seemingly unrepairable tear in their marriage. Cunningly it had been arranged to take place when several witnesses who would have damned Ralph Barclay were away on another duty, courtesy of Admiral Hotham, the verdict coming as a shock on Pearce's return, especially when he discovered that none of the written depositions he and the Pelicans had dictated to one of Hotham's clerks had been introduced as testimony. "You may say what you wish, Heinrich, about the lax morals of the Latins, but to me, the vision of a British officer being required to flee the bedroom of a married woman is shocking." "I fear you would find the behaviour of most British naval officers shocking, my dear." Working as she was on her embroidery, the needle moved more speedily, as an indication of her discomfort. If he had not mentioned the whorehouses of Livorno, he was alluding to them. "Then I hope you will forbear to enlighten me." "There was one tale I heard that is amusing." Seeing her lift both head and eyebrows, he continued, "Do you know the name Harvey?" "Is that not the name of the Earls of Bristol?" "Indeed. Coming from Somerset, I thought you would know it. A family of bishops and politicians to boot, though it is one of their number who was a post-captain, a certain Augustus Harvey, who generated this tale. Seemingly he was based in Leghorn during the 7 Years' conflict, and was such a Lothario, and so enamoured of those loose Latin morals you so deplore, he managed to father some 50 bastards." "Why are you telling me this?" "Perhaps to put in some context the behaviour of John Pearce, whom you seem eager to condemn. Compared to Harvey, he's a novice." "Two wrongs do not make a right." "Nor do 50, my dear. And nor does your continuing refusal to share the quarters of your husband." That stopped the needle, but she still looked at the threaded pattern. "I thought you, of all people, Heinrich, would not seek to chastise me for that." "I do not seek to chastise you, my dear, merely to point out to you that none of us are perfect. I would also point out, and I do this out of regard for you, that tongues are wagging aboard this ship as they were in Toulon. It was a mistake to decline to join your husband for dinner with Captain Dawes. That will be remarked upon." "I cannot help it. The thought of sitting in pretence, of behaving as if all is well, appalls me." "Perhaps it does, but I think you must turn your mind to how you are going to behave once we are back in England. Such an attitude will not serve." "Do you think I've not thought about it already?" "And?" Tears wetted her eyes and affected her voice as she replied, "I am at a loss to know what to do." Chapter 12. Getting into the Bay of Algeciras was difficult at any time, lying as it did on the western side of the Rock of Gibraltar. The tidal flow into the Mediterranean was strong, and it needed a good wind from the east to weather Punta Europa. For 2 days the wind was, while not dead foul, far from helpful, so HMS Grampus was required to beat up, tack on tack, to make any headway. The delay gave Gerson time to seek to isolate Rufus Dommett, something he utterly failed to achieve. Every time he got within 10 feet of the youngster, Rufus sought out Charlie Taverner, and a glare from that source was enough to stop Gerson in his tracks. Forced to seek an accommodation with Taverner, he was exposed to a stream of loud and foul abuse, as well as a question from Michael O'Hagan as to his ability to swim. Frustrated, he sought out Devereux to seek his aid, well aware that the brute had reservations about him, jealousy of a man closer to his captain than he. The conversation was not one to produce a conclusion, but Devereux was vocal about one thing: the way the Pelicans were sure they were free men. In the end it was Rufus who underlined that belief by boasting, within the hearing of another sailor, one Devereux was successfully able to bully, that the order for their release from the Navy came from the mighty Sam Hood himself, a point Gerson made to his employer. Why, Captain Barclay, would Lord Hood do that if he had no reason? Ralph Barclay, mulling on that question, was aware he should have been more curious from the very beginning about the presence of Pearce and his friends on board HMS Grampus, though he did grant himself some leeway for the fact of his lost arm. The mere fact that they were travelling back to England should have alerted him to something, even if he knew not what. That alone makes me doubly suspicious, Gerson added. Doubly? Gerson was good at extracting advantage from scanty knowledge, a necessary gift if you wanted to become someone on whom your principal relied. Thus his hesitation, and the adoption of the look which accompanied it, of deep thought mixed with an air of doubt, meant to convey that he was not sure he should speak at all. He had unfortunately forgotten the level of impatience innate to the man with whom he was dealing. "Do not trifle with me, Gerson. If you have something to impart, do it, and cut out the play-acting." The wish to protest died in the face of Ralph Barclay's glare. Yet there was some pleasure to be obtained from being just a little brusque. "I overheard John Pearce say he expects to see you in the dock, that followed by jail, and he used an expression which implied the charge would be perjury." The words struck Ralph Barclay hard, so hard he had trouble in retaining an equable countenance, and at that moment his lost arm was a blessing, the act of easing it providing time to swallow the import of what had just been said. "He is a man prone to bluster, Gerson," he said eventually. "Oh, he is, sir, as we both know, a man prone to many things. What we don't know is plain. Was he engaging in bluster? Or speaking the truth?" "How could he be?" "If I may be allowed to quote him, sir, he said that with the evidence he had, he would see you in the dock." Ralph Barclay was not looking at Gerson any more. He was looking at his own knees, his mind set to racing by the word evidence. As sharp to his own advantage as the man before him, it took only seconds to run through the various scenarios that would give some substance to those repeated words. Hotham was a treacherous sod, of that he was sure. All admirals were. But he could not drop him in the soup without being damaged himself, and he could discount Devereux or Kemp. For a fleeting moment he wondered if Gerson was playing a double game, before dismissing that too. In his mind's eye he was back in that cabin-cum-courtroom, with the faces of the men who had judged him prominent. They would stand by their verdict, or risk looking foolish. But there were 2 people present who could damage him, and it gave him no pleasure to think one of them was his own wife. Yet she was barred from testifying against him by that very relationship, which left only her nephew, Toby Burns. Had that little cowardly toad given something to Pearce that could hurt him? And if he had, what could it be? "You will, I suspect, sir, have arrived at the same conclusion as me?" "Which is?" "Mr. Burns?" "He is still aboard HMS Britannia." "Perhaps he made a deposition." "When?" "We were in Leghorn for 10 days. No, Gerson, the boy hates Pearce as much as I do. If he saw the bastard, he would run a mile. Besides, any deposition would have to be witnessed by some kind of notary. Or perhaps another post-captain. Who is Pearce friendly with? I believe he got on rather well with Captain Nelson, though there may be others we have no knowledge of. Seeing the effect that had on his employer, the implication that he was unpopular in places of which he had no knowledge, Gerson continued quickly, I confess, sir, I'm unsure if deposing an affidavit to a post-captain would carry the necessary weight to imperil anyone. Sorry, Gerson, it won't wash. Not with Toby Burns. Cornelius Gerson knew that another name had come to Ralph Barclay's mind before he spoke, just by the look, a mixture of hate and alarm which swept across his face. When he spat the name, it made perfect sense. Hood! Or did he not confirm the conclusion of the court, sir, as he was bound to do as Commander-in-Chief? He would not have done it with any pleasure, given he has little regard for me. Lack enough to admit his confirmation was a sham? Surely the one cancels out the other and leaves only malice as a motive, which would be easy to discredit with a good advocate. Ralph Barclay's eyes narrowed as he looked at his clerk. You seem to know a lot about the law, Gerson. I know enough, sir, to be sure that the verdict in any case is never certain. He nearly added, except your court-martial, but thought better of it. And that applies to both the plaintiff and the accused. Say Pearce has something. Whatever it is must be aboard with him. And he is berthed in the wardroom to which we do not have access. From looking pensive, Ralph Barclay suddenly brightened up. We are making for Gibraltar, Gerson, and I know it to be a place where every officer, Marines included, excepting the poor fellow left on watch, will go ashore. As a watch officer on deck, that means the wardroom will be unoccupied. The look Ralph Barclay was giving Gerson made his stomach turn over. There was no way a one-armed post-captain, still convalescent, could go skulking about a ship, even if it was at anchor. His employer was telling him, when it came to going through the belongings of John Pearce, it was a job for him. There will still be the wardroom servants, he replied, trying to keep a note of panic out of his voice. He was not averse to theft. It was getting caught which bothered him. With their charges ashore, they will stay snug in their quarters, or mix with the rest of the crew. The Marine Guard? I know doors to be lax in the article of women at anchor. With the wardroom empty, all the lobsters will be occupied making sure the whores don't bring illicit drink aboard. Still, sir, Gerson, I cannot do it, and you know why. If you would have a future with me, this is a deed that must be done. Otherwise I might as well call upon Captain Dawes and tell him he has a new hand for the lower deck. Cornelius Gerson, while thinking he had no choice, was also thinking that one day he would make Ralph Barclay pay for that threat. Devereux will help you by keeping watch, and if you wish, I will walk the main deck and seek to engage the wardroom servants in conversation, should they show themselves. In the end, the boats had to be used to warp HMS Grampus into Algeciras Bay, the great bight of water which housed Spanish warships on one side and a British squadron on the other, from where they had eyed each other, and occasionally fought each other, since the Treaty of Utrecht, which ceded the Rock to the first King George. Not surprising, since his forces had possession of it, and were not about to relinquish what was, after all, the key to the Mediterranean. Besieged several times, possession had often been hanging by a thread, but it was a central plank of British maritime policy, second only to command of the Channel, that it must be held, whatever the cost. 90-plus years of occupation had turned it from a Spanish entity to a mixed one, for while it had a strong garrison and many British officials, the place could not have functioned without the aid of the indigenes, happy to accept a steady wage and ignore whatever it was they owed to the Spanish crown. The taverns looked, in all respects, as if they could have stood close to the heart of Portsmouth harbour, but the women who served the ale were as dark-skinned as they were buxom. Every sort of vice was, of course, catered for, and hardly had Grampus dropped her best bower anchor than the boats were in the water to carry ashore those who desired to partake of the many pleasures Gibraltar had to offer. That included trusted members of the crew, and given the Pelicans were not on the ship's muster, it was not surprising that they too were intent on going ashore. But it was officers and warrants first, obliging them to wait for a boat, since they were unwilling to pay for their transport. The last person in the wardroom, Pearce, stood in his tiny cabin weighing in his hand the fair copy of Barclay's court-martial report, a loose, bulky sheaf of papers, wondering whether to take it ashore, and deciding against it, yet being unsure if it was safe here. Lutyens he knew to be staying aboard, so he opted to leave it with him. There was also Hood's letter, sealed and still in its oilskin pouch, something the surgeon knew nothing about, and it would be best kept that way. So it he left behind, along with the order releasing his friends from the service. Padlocking the chest did not occur to him. The only things he feared to lose were in his hands, and any money he had was in his purse. His last act was to open the lantern that lit his cabin and extinguish the flame. Bumboats surrounded the ship, trading through the gun ports, and since, as Ralph Barclay had said, Captain Dawes was no prig, women had come aboard to turn the lower decks into a scene of music, singing, and a fair amount of indiscreet carnality. Every one had been searched by marines for illicit spirits, rum and gin, a lot of which, given the cunning of the carriers, the lobsters failed to find, meaning that a degree of drunkenness was added to the mix. Such activities confined Emily Barclay to the quarters she had taken up next to those of Heinrich Lutyens. She could hear the noise of merriment, but would shudder to walk through it, just as she could also hear, through a very thin partition, the request that the surgeon take care of a package Pearce did not want to leave unattended while he was off the ship. "The transcript of the court-martial, I presume?" the surgeon inquired. Pearce's reply was soft, so low she had to struggle to hear it, and was ashamed of herself for her eavesdropping, even more so for moving closer to do so more effectively. "Heinrich, I have never mentioned aboard this ship that I have possession of these papers, and I would be grateful if you would avoid mentioning it too. Ships are not places to discuss secrets, something you have already alluded to." "I am being admonished." "You know I trust you of all people, so silence on this is mere precaution. Only you and my friends know Lord Hood let me copy the transcript of Barclay's court-martial, and I would like it kept that way. If he knew of its existence, who knows what he might resort to in order to stop it reaching London." "I shall put it in the case with my bone saws. No one will lay a hand on those for a superstitious fear that to do so might see them lose a limb." "Thank you. You are going to enjoy the flesh-pots of Gibraltar, I take it." "I am going to share a drink with Michael, Charlie, and Rufus, something I cannot do aboard ship. Fortunately, Gibraltar is so awash with taverns we should have no trouble finding one where we will not be observed. I have some questions I need to put to them, questions to which I badly require answers." "For instance, what you and they are going to do when you reach England." "Is it that obvious?" "To anyone with half a brain." "A question, my friend, which applies equally to you." "Odd, is it not, John? We have a ship full of people who fear going home as much as they yearn for it." That hit Emily hard, making her recoil from listening, so the last exchanges were naught but a murmur, making her wonder if they were about her. Devereux was not pleased at being denied the pleasures being enjoyed all around him, both women and drink. But if Captain Ralph Barclay commanded, he would obey. Loitering near the wardroom doors, now without a sentry, his broad back covered the ingress of Cornelius Gerson, who called softly to cover his entry as, carrying a shed lantern, he slipped through one of the double doors, lest there be someone who had remained behind. The pantry, where the servants might loiter, he had checked first. The main cabin was empty, as Berkeley had predicted. The octagonal table that dominated the centre of the room, really a panelled and painted cover to hide the head of the rudder, and the chairs set by it, showing evidence of the hurried departure of those who messed here. Working coats and hats slung off, brushes and the like that had been used to clean their best uniforms, a smattering of powder over the places where a wig had been carelessly dressed, for the master, older than the others, still adhered to that old-fashioned habit. Given the disorder, it was obvious what Berkeley had said about the servants was true. "There are 7 cabins," Berkeley had informed him. "You can avoid the accommodation of the Premier, his second lieutenant, and the master, which are on the larboard side. There are 4 smaller cabins to starboard, and Pearce will not be gifted anything approaching the best. The one you want will likely be that nearest to the quarter-gallery that serves as the wardroom privy. I made sure Dawes was aware of the poison he was carrying, and I know that that was a message he passed on to his officers. Pearce is lucky not to be bedded in the privy itself, but he will be close to the stink of the place, which serves him well." The space was tiny, painted white, and barely big enough to sling the cot that filled it. The lantern, unshaded, revealed Pearce's sea chest, with his initials upon it, parked beneath. Lifting the lid, the first thing Gerson saw was the oilskin pouch, and that went straight into his coat pocket. Rummaging around, all he could discover were spare shirts and stockings, plus an old battered tin which, when he prized it open, revealed compacted, dry earth, a bit of which fell to the floor and had to be hurriedly brushed into the planking. Satisfied he might have what he was looking for, Gerson shaded the lantern again and made his way back out onto the main deck, nodding to Devereux to tell him that he could go and indulge himself with the rest of the crew. Then it was back to Ralph Berkeley to open the pouch and see what it contained. The folded but unsealed order releasing the Pelicans, signed by Parker, was of interest, causing Berkeley to curse both the captain of the fleet and the man he served. It was also a strong indication that, despite Hood confirming the verdict of his court-martial, he harboured doubts about it, which made Berkeley wonder what that might portend, though he was quick to dismiss any worry. The trio named were lowly seamen, so any threat they might present would be minimal. The response was different when he examined the letter. "The Right Honourable William Pitt, M.P., Berkeley said in a hushed tone when he examined the superscription. Then he turned it over to look at the seal, catching his breath as he examined it. "Damn me, that's Hood's seal." "May I?" Gerson asked, holding out a hand, taking the letter and examining it when Berkeley did as he was bid. "I take it you would wish to know the contents, sir?" That got Gerson a hard look. "Am I right in thinking you can open this?" "Not only open it, but reseal it so no one would know it's been tampered with." "I am forced to ask what it was you did to earn a crust prior to joining the Navy, Gerson." That got a terse response. "I think you of all people, sir, know I did not join. I was pressed." "That is all water under the bridge," Berkeley spat, before laughing as he saw the horrified look on Gerson's face. "An inadvertent pun, but by the devil a good one." "Let me take this to my berth." "No. Whatever you do must be done in my presence." "You do not trust me, sir?" "Nonsense," Berkeley lied. "Of course I do, but I want to see how it is done." Unconvinced, Gerson gave him back the letter and exited, to return in a few minutes carrying a knife so thin the blade appeared too flexible to wound. He also had a shaker of wig powder and a square of cloth. "Where did you get those?" "In Toulon, sir. Where else? Please be so good as to fetch over that lantern and open the door." That done, Gerson lifted a cushion off the stern locker and smoothed the cloth over the bare wood. Then he laid the letter on that and very carefully sprinkled a little powder around the seal. He indicated to Berkeley to put the lantern down, heating his thin knife blade over the tallow flame, turning it this way and that until it glowed. then took it off the flame and allowed it to cool.
It must be hot, but not so that it will burn the paper on which the letter is written, which is fortunately of a very high quality.
That makes a difference.
Very much so, sir, given this would be much more difficult with paper of poor quality. That marks more readily.
Kneeling down, Gerson spread his index finger and thumb and pressed down on the paper, peering close to slip the hot blade under the very edge of the seal, flattening it, then making a gentle sawing motion as he worked the wax loose.
The powder takes the heat, not the paper, so there is no burn mark.
Barclay reached for the now open letter, only to have Gerson knock his hand away.
You must wait till the wax is completely cooled.
Ralph Barclay had to stop himself from swiping him with his one good hand. No one treated him with such contempt, but he was too curious about the contents of the letter to do so. Gerson closed the lantern door, and once he had unfolded the letter, he held it over the writing so that both Barclay and he could easily read it.
By damn! He's trying to ditch Hotham, the old fraud.
I see no mention of you, sir, and that I think is more important.
Are you sure this was all you could find?
Yes, Gerson snapped.
Do not get above yourself, Gerson. I won't stand for it.
What do you want to do with this?
Can you reseal it?
Of course. Ralph Barclay had to restrain himself again. No one talked to him in such a manner, damn near to sneering, regardless of their nefarious skills.
Then it needs to be copied, resealed, and returned to Pearce's sea chest.
What?
Which, Gerson, means you best get about it.
He had to take it back to his berth, carefully refolded and hidden inside his coat. There he quickly copied what Hood had written and took it back to Barclay's cabin, where, blowing off what powder remained, he reheated his knife and ran it over the exposed back of the seal, taking care to keep his other hand underneath the wax to ensure it did not drip. The act of resealing was carried out quickly, pressure applied to allow the melted wax to congeal. Having waited to make sure it was solid, Gerson slipped it back into the oilskin pouch.
You will have to aid me, sir.
What? Barclay exclaimed, lifting his head from Gerson's fair copy.
Devereux went to join his kind. If he is not astride some whore, he will be in drink, and I would not trust him in that state to keep watch for me. No, Gerson, I cannot be seen to be complicit. This is a task you must carry out alone.
What if I were to suggest, sir, that it need not be returned?
You are not shy, are you, man?
No, sir. I am at risk, while you are not.
In a good cause, Gerson, Barclay replied, trying and failing to suppress a yawn. Best, I think, you do what must be done quickly.
The mutual eye contact was far from friendly, but both men knew that there was little choice in the matter.
After all, Barclay added, we would not want you caught in the wardroom once our stalwarts come back from their revels. It is not unknown for officers in drink to be free with their fists.
Sat anxiously with the book she had been trying to read in her lap, Emily Barclay prayed that Lutyens would leave his part of their shared berth, while also alternating between determination and apprehension. There was also the problem of justifying her intention, rationalized on the grounds that, with difficult decisions to make regarding her own future, she needed to know what Pearce's words portended for the man to whom she was married. Every time she tried to read, the words perjury and court-martial played on her mind, and it was with a panicked reaction she got the book up to her nose as the screen twitched before being hauled back.
I must walk the deck and see what is going on, Lutyens said.
Hardly necessary, Heinrich, Emily replied automatically, before cursing herself. You can hear enough to guess.
A picture paints 1,000 words.
The picture of which you speak requires only one. Disgraceful. That got her a wan smile.
We must not be too quick to judge. Then he was gone, and she strained to hear his receding footsteps before pulling back the curtain once more to ensure he had truly departed. Seeing no one, she slipped quickly into the other berth, kneeling before the chest in which he kept his instruments, many secured to the lid of his chest. The case with the bone saws she recognized immediately, having seen it too many times since her first experience of helping him treat the wounded. The papers were not hidden. They lay instead on top, and a quick perusal of the first sheets told her precisely what they contained, though her heart skipped a beat to read the words, written in a fine, sloping hand, which opened her husband's trial. Leafing through, she came to the parts at which she had been present, the words, or to be more accurate, the lies, familiar from memory. There was no time to read them all, and no need. She knew what they were, and that sufficed. When Lutyens returned, looking in to say he had done so, she was still holding the book, but reading it, difficult before, had become impossible now. Chapter 13. With a great deal of shipping in Gibraltar, finding a quiet corner to talk was not easy. That made doubly difficult by the obvious desire of his trio of friends to visit the more interesting fleshpots. Rufus, in particular, having dipped his wick in Leghorn, was afire to compare where they were now with what he had experienced there, and it took damn near an order from John Pearce to get them to allow him the time he thought he needed.
"Sure," Michael O'Hagan said. "The Navy all comes down to where you were serving and who you were under, John boy."
Then he grinned.
"And I'd add to that, the number of heathens you have to mess with."
"Dogs lead a better life," said Charlie, leaving Rufus, who had been nodding at Michael's opinion, half shaking his head at the same time.
"Like the one you led when we met?"
asked Pearce.
"I was my own master, John,"
Charlie insisted, before looking around, he being sat on the very edge of the booth they were occupying, to ensure he had not been overheard.
"Holy Mary, Mother of God," Michael swore, crossing himself out of habit. "You as a master of anything makes a soul shudder."
Pearce looked at him hard.
"You were damn near starving, Charlie, and I recall your tankard was empty and I had to fill it."
"I had me mates," he replied, suddenly looking wistful. "Old Abel, God rest his soul, was a good friend, and Ben." "I wonder whether he is still in the land of the living," said Rufus, his gaze on John Pearce.
"Don't look at me like that, Rufus. There was nothing I could do that would not get us all killed."
That had them drinking silently, and thinking about Ben Walker, who, for reasons of his own, had declined to leave HMS Brilliant and the command of Ralph Barclay off the coast of Brittany when given the chance. Pearce knew that to be a better vision of him than the last time he had clapped eyes on him, toiling as an emaciated slave burdened by grain sacks, and being whipped to move faster by a pitiless overseer on the Barbary shore. Ben had recognized John Pearce, blue coat and all, which had led to a confrontation with the whip-bearing overseer, and a noisy one at that, only to find himself surrounded by the quick arrival of armed men. Forced to go back aboard ship, as much by his own superiors as any threat of weaponry, Pearce had set out to mount a rescue, thwarted by the man who commanded the ship on which he was serving. The fact that such an intervention was fitting did not make the memory of having to leave Ben to his fate any more palatable. Looking over the taffrail at Tunis sinking into the horizon had been hard, reckoning as he did that he was leaving a friend to die. "Can't understand why he didn't want to come with us," Charlie said, shaking his head. "You had words with him, John. Do you know?" "I think he'd found a place, Charlie, and maybe some peace. He never told you why he was in the Liberties, did he? What he was running from? The rest of you were open. He was not." It was Rufus who articulated the agreement. "No, he kept that to himself. Close was Ben."
"Then I reckon it was something he could not happily live with,"
Pearce responded. Somehow he saw the Navy as a break with whatever it was. "Bad, then?" Rufus asked. "We'll never know, will we?" At that moment, hundreds of miles to the east, Ben Walker, well-fed and healthy, was continuing in his efforts to learn Arabic, without which he could not go on to be instructed in the Mussulman's holy book, the Koran. His teacher, appointed by the Bey of Tunis in an act of caprice that hinted at salvation, was a grey-beard with soft brown eyes that mirrored a gentle manner. To Ben it was barely believable. By reputation the pirates of the Barbary coast, and the Bey was certainly that, were the stuff of nightmares, inclined to sell into concubinage any women they captured. Men were either killed or made slaves. Ben had enjoyed a brief moment of hope when he espied John Pearce, only to see that disappear as the local power forced him to retreat, the whole played out on his defenceless back by the man who whipped him doubly hard for his disobedience. He had then been dragged off by force, this pointing to only one fate, and Ben had no idea what had saved him from summary execution. He only knew that, being interrogated by one of the Bey's courtiers, for the first time since he killed the girl he deeply loved and the man who had seduced her, he had told another human the story, and allowed the tears he should have shed years ago to flow. Instead of the beheading he anticipated, no doubt after a decent bout of cruel torture for both his crime and his Christianity, he had been treated with gentility, first bathed and allowed new clothes, then taken to the comfortable cell he still occupied, fed so that from being a near skeleton he had been brought back to full rude health. The price of his deliverance was this instruction. He had no idea of the why and wherefores. He only knew that life was better than death, and that he had gratitude for whatever god of whatever religion had intervened to let him live. Alone at night he often wondered about the men with whom he had been pressed from the Pelican Tavern. Given his solitary life, more than they thought about him. Men he had come to know through shared misfortune, and even more closely through shared adventure. When they had left to go back to England, he had declined to join them, knowing he would be returning to a life he had not enjoyed one bit, a life where his past deeds weighed heavily on his conscience. Often he envisaged that separation, those last farewell gestures from the deck of the merchantman they were taking home, a quartet of figures in their ducks and short jackets. Given that image, he had struggled with another. What in the name of eternity had John Pearce been doing in an officer's blue coat, and behaving as though he was entitled to the wearing of it? Had the others been with him, Charlie, Rufus, and that giant O'Hagan? The thing he thought about most, though, was obvious. His own eventual fate. For what had he been spared? So perhaps he would make a more convincing victim? Those were the thoughts of the dark nights. During the day, as he was allowed to wander with an escort the courtyards and hallways of the Bey's palace, allowed to dip his finger in the many cool fountains, and even occasionally be taken outside the palace walls and into the bazaar, Ben Walker wondered if he had been blessed in some way. But more than that, he wondered if he had been forgiven.
"To Ben and Abel may God bless and keep them," said Michael, lifting his tankard, and as the others joined with him, emptying it in honour of their dead comrades.
That made John Pearce more reflective than the others. Abel Scrivens, crushed between barrels in the deep hold of HMS Brilliant, had died in place of him, the real target of the malice of Martin Dent. Odd that he thought of the boy in a kindly way now. How strange life was. So many things had been resolved when they had all been stranded on the Breton shore, not least that Martin had behaved with enough bravery and application to impress him, even more so when the boy asked him for forgiveness. He knew for a fact that he had come into his own then, had shown that he could think clearly in a crisis, lead, and, more importantly, command both loyalty and obedience. That was until he thought of Toby Burns, who had not only proved to be lily-livered, but deeply treacherous to boot. The mention of his name darkened Michael's demeanour.
"Sure," he growled.
I am not a man to wish ill on anybody, but if the good Lord could see fit to take off that boy's head with a cannonball, I would be content." "A lying little shite, that Toby Burns, Michael," added Charlie. "Now don't you go giving shite a bad name." "Refills," said Pearce. Toby Burns was on deck, sharing the watch with Mr. Beddoes, trying to look as martial as possible, with HMS Britannia ploughing her way towards Corsica and more battle. The bandage he had been required to abandon, but he had taken to combing his hair forward over his brow when not wearing his hat, and if those he messed with wondered if there was a scar to show, they were too polite to ask. After all, their fellow midshipman was much cosseted by Admiral Hotham, and no one wanted to offend him. In a ship of few secrets, there was no ship in the fleet adept at keeping those, the proposed destination towards which they were heading was common knowledge. The town at the base of the Bay of San Fiorenzo was to be the first place on the island that Lord Hood intended to subdue. It was even known how many arguments he had undertaken with his army generals, who were averse to any kind of action until they had more troops to command, acquiescing in the attack only when not to do so would smack of being shy. Naturally, being bullocks, they had to be got ashore before they could fight anyone. Toby Burns had learnt that he, under the command of Beddoes, had been given a place on the first draft of boats that would land them on the hostile shore. At dinner, after orders had been issued, those others who would have the same sort of duty had been eager to talk of how quickly they too could get ashore and take part in the action. They at least were honest, if foolish, in contrast to the hypocritical senior of the mid's berth, who would be remaining aboard. He had somehow escaped the proposed landing.
"Burns, you of all people must be afire to add more lustre to your reputation. I am envious in the extreme."
Looking at a man near 30 years of age, a shallow thinker whom he knew would never make lieutenant, the fellow having already failed the examination twice, he wondered on how unfair life was, while at the same time enthusiastically acceding to the expressed sentiment. The older fellow only kept his place as a mid so he could be fed and watered at the king's expense. With no pay and no private means, he would have been reduced to beggary ashore. His seniority in the berth came from his years, not his ability. Why was it that such a useless creature was spared risk when he was so regularly exposed? Toasting the coming attack with wine that was almost undrinkable, he thought back to the last time he had taken a boat into a proposed attack. God, he hoped the man who would command him off that round tower was cleverer than the old bugger who had run them aground in Brittany. He had nearly drowned in a maelstrom of rocks and spume-filled water for want of the man's ability to steer the right course. And then he had been stranded with that swine Pearce and the others, who had acted as if he should solve their problem. He would have done if left to his own devices, surrender being better than stupid sacrifice. But no, clever Clogs Pearce had had them all risking their necks in the most stupid fashion and for, to his mind, a dubious purpose.
"By God, Burns!"
the senior cried from the top of the table, his face flushed from overconsumption, his voice laced with drunken hyperbole.
"You have about you the face of wrath itself. God help Johnny Crapo when he feels your steel."
Hear him, called the rest of the berth, all red-faced, all taken with drink, as they slammed their pewter mugs on the table in support of the senior. The question still stands, friends. What are you going to do? Greeted with shrugs, Pearce carried on, enumerating the thoughts on which he had already ruminated. Michael, surprisingly, looking less than pleased at the prospect of going back to his shovel.
"You don't get it, John boy. It's a short life, and as sure as there is a God in heaven, it is a hard one. The men who employ we Irish don't care much if we live or die, and enough do when a trench falls in or a shored-up wall of earth gives way."
"The pay is good," Rufus said with a melancholy air. As an indentured apprentice, he had not seen much in the way of that commodity. "It needs to be, Rufus," Michael replied, "for the work is endless. You would not know near despair till you've dug out a lake for some great lord, with teeming rain on your back, or sunk a shaft for a new mine, up to your knees in water." "You drank every penny you earned," chuckled Charlie. "With what I was doing by day, drink by night was what kept me going. I won't say sailing a ship is easy, nor will I say it is not without risk, but by Jesus it has the legs on ditch digging." "Do you want to go back to the Liberties, Charlie?" "You know I don't, John, just as you know I might not have a choice." "You could go back to Lichfield, Rufus. You would surely be safe there." Looking at Pearce, Rufus shook his head. "What do you think my master would have done when I ran? He will have demanded back from my pa what he paid to indenture me. The only thing I would get back in Lichfield is the back of his hand, and more than once before being tied once more to a bench." "Warrants might have expired," Charlie said, but not with a look of any hope. "And you, John boy, what are you going to do?" "You mean after I see Barclay locked up in the Fleet, Michael?" He looked at them all in turn. "Put your hands on the table, palms up." Slowly they obliged, showing skin near black, so ingrained was it with the tar from ropework. There was no need to say what he was implying, but he did so anyway. "Even if you can dodge the tipstaffs, you'll be had up by every crimp in creation, and the first thing they will do is ask to see those same hands." Then he looked at their heads. "Pigtails don't help much either. You'll be tagged as sailors right off, and unless I can get you protections, you'll be back aboard a king's ship in days, and it's not unknown for them to be ripped up in your face." "There will be broken bones and blood spilt, John boy, if a body tries that." "Yours, Michael. The crimps will take one look at the size of you and resort to clubs. Charlie and Rufus they will just nab by force of numbers." That induced another bout of silence. What John Pearce was saying was true. To press them would be as illegal as the first and second times it had happened. But once you were on board a ship and out of sight of land, that counted for little. "There are ways to avoid the press, John," said Rufus, "as every man aboard will tell you." "Not in a port, Rufus. You would need to go inland to be really safe, and I don't need to say what risks you run then. Even the Liberties have already proved not to be that. Safe, I mean." "But you can get us protections?" asked Charlie. John Pearce knew what he was driving at. The men who wanted to execute the warrant on Charlie Taverner, who stood on the exits to the Liberties of the Savoy looking for anyone foolish enough to step outside the safe boundary, would have eyes for a fellow quite different to the man sitting opposite Pearce now. Charlie had kept his hair short before. Now he had a pigtail. He had walked like any other soul. Now he could not help but sway like a sailor, and his tarred hands might be a shield against arrest. The warrant was issued for a landsman. "I think I can, but I would say to you, stay aboard Grampus until I put them in your hand." But let's go back to the question Michael first posed. The truth is, I have no occupation, and little in the way of coin, so I have to find some way of living while the case goes through the lawyers, and I think that will take time, a lot of time if the Admiralty defends Barclay. "So?" asked Michael. "My first job on going ashore is to take a private letter from Lord Hood to the King's First Minister. It was he who got me out to the Mediterranean to rescue you in the first place, and I have good grounds to believe if I ask him for a favour he might grant it." "That favour being what?" "Maybe I can get the warrants on Charlie and Rufus lifted, or, failing that, find us a berth that will keep us in body and soul and keep us together." "A naval one?" asked Rufus. "Probably." "With pay?" "Of course." "You're forgetting, John," said Charlie, grinning, "that the first thing we want is to see your back." "The only time you want to see my back, Charlie, is when I'm ordering more ale." "For which," Charlie replied, waving his tankard, "you seem a bit slow to get a moving on, which I seem to recall is your way. You needed a nudge the night we met." Emily Barclay had given up trying to read. Those papers she had found under Lutyens' bone sores impinged too much on her thinking, and the ramifications of what they would mean were endless. For her husband, they would possibly mean a life in hard labour or transportation, and, much as she had come to see him in an unflattering way, even if she knew the case to be correct, she yet did not want to see that wished upon him. If he was incarcerated, what would become of her? Was it a selfish thought to imagine a life in the shadow of that disgrace? Certainly one in which she would have no income, for his pay would cease with conviction, but also one in which she would be left in the limbo of a grass widowhood. How would she live? No one would take her in as a governess, the only occupation for which she could lay any claim to be qualified, with that stain of association to her name, leaving her with the vision of a life spent in penury, perhaps as a washerwoman or a seamstress. Then there was her family. What would become of them? The house they occupied, indeed the reason they had been so keen on her marriage, was entailed to Ralph Barclay through a line of obscure cousinage to her mother's family. Had she refused his offer, he might have turfed them out. What would happen to his property if he was a convicted felon? Would it be forfeit? Would they be rendered homeless? Raised to be respectable, never to do anything to bring the family name in disrepute, how could her family walk the streets of Frome with this hanging about their heads? If she knew it to be a bit of a backwater, Emily also knew that it encompassed their whole life, and had hers until she came to sea. Many times it had been a duty to visit and give succour to those unfortunates forced into the workhouse. It was all too easy to imagine that was where her parents would be forced to reside, given they had between them only the most meagre of stipends upon which to support themselves, certainly too constrained to allow for the cost of renting a decent house. The noise of merriment had abated somewhat, what with both coin and bodies exhausted, even those on the fiddle and the flutes sending out weary sounds. The greater noise was of those coming back on board from their exertions in Gibraltar, with much shouting of a drunken nature, fortunately too indistinct to tell her, as they were telling their shipmates, what they had been about. No one would be allowed to sleep ashore, for if Captain Dawes was lax in the article of what happened in his absence, he was not about to allow others a privilege denied to him. No captain could spend their night outside their ship without express permission, and he had made that a condition of anyone going ashore this night. The Pelicans came back aboard as merry as anyone, for their quiet conversation had given way to a move to noisier and more entertaining places. Rufus was grinning from ear to ear, content to be ribbed by Michael and Charlie. John Pearce was inebriated, but still, in his mind, he knew that nothing had been truly resolved. Matters would have to wait until they dropped anchor in whatever harbour for which HMS Grampus was headed. He had no inkling that anyone had been in his cabin until the next morning, when, with a clearer eye and seeking a clean shirt, he saw traces of dirt in the gaps between the planking and places where the caulking had, like almost all of it aboard this ship, moved. Touching it, smelling it, he then reached into his chest and brought out the tin of earth. Taken from a Parisian graveyard in which he had buried his father, it was to him a talisman, for he had sworn that one day he would return to that spot, exhume the remains of Adam Pearce, and take him home to Edinburgh for burial. It only took a pinch of that, matched to what he had observed on the floor, to tell him his sea chest had been searched. It also took no imagination whatsoever to guess who might have been the culprit. An examination of Hood's letter, taken into the cabin and to the stern casements for better light, showed it to be intact. That at least had not been interfered with. But he had to thank his luck that he had left the really important papers with Lutyens. Unless... He was reassured as soon as he inquired. Lutyens looked, and they were still where they had been left. "Would you do me a service, Heinrich, and keep them there?" "You do not see your own cabin as secure?" the surgeon inquired, his pointy nose in the air denoting his surprise. Here is safer, brother." "So be it." Looking past John Pearce, he said happily, "Emily, my dear." Pearce turned to look at her, smiling. She had come to ask Lutyens about those papers, but the words died on her lips, and she turned and left quickly, leaving John Pearce to grimace to his friend. Chapter 14. Dawn brought on a sore head, not much helped by unexplained excitement, running feet on the deck rather than the accustomed and soporific sound of holystoning, causing John Pearce to go on deck, there to find HMS Grampus, seemingly with half the ships anchored in the bay, being made ready to weigh, which was strange, given he could feel the wind was gusting uncertainly with no fixed direction. Not on friendly terms with his fellow officers, he was not able to ask any of them why they were so cheerful. In the end it was the master, an older man and less constrained by the captain, who enlightened him to the presence of a levanter, which, if it increased in strength, would be the perfect wind to get them through the strong east-running current that came in from the Atlantic. "See that cloud above the rock, Mr. Pearce, the way it seems to be blowing off the peak towards the west like a triangle? That is a sure sign, and if the wind increases, it is even better." "You will know?" "For sure, given that there cloud will break away and disperse. Then we will have a right proper wind of strength enough to make getting out as easy as kissing my hand. We shall weather Tarifa with no trouble at all, instead of being obliged to creep along the coast." And so it proved, for the wind strengthened to make taut the whole top hamper, the ship heeling over from the pressure as she cleared Algeciras Bay, to be driven through a choppy sea and out and away from the southern Spanish coast. To the south rose the high mountains of Morocco, and, as the master had said, they weathered Punta Tarifa at the extreme range of the fortress thereon. Pearce was reminded of what he had been previously told, that when at war with Spain, Gibraltar was a damned difficult place to get in and out of unscathed. Ralph Barclay had come on deck, and for once Pearce did not avoid his basilisk stare. Yet he was taken by something else in that look, almost a gleam of triumph. Devereux and Gerson were behind him, with Pearce wondering which of them had rifled his sea-chest, but he had no notion it had been one of the wardroom servants. Had they been so inclined, they would not have lasted in what was an undemanding position. It seemed to him that he had been at war with Barclay from the first night he had encountered him, and was wont to wonder if that had produced in him an effect that was untoward. Had he become obsessed? Once clear of the straits, the course was set to cross the Bay of Cadiz, again one which would not have been taken in a time of conflict, Cadiz being the main base for the Spanish fleet. The destination, once they had weathered Cape St. Vincent, being Lisbon. Some subterfuge had to be used in the ship's logs to justify such an act, but it was a time-honoured diversion for naval officers, frowned on in public and ignored in private, the Portuguese capital being the place where the mercantile city of London looked for its supplies of gold and silver. Brought in from South America to both Spain and Portugal, Lisbon was the preferred trading port for British merchants, that nation being an old and trusted ally. Naturally, everyone in Europe knew that such precious metals were the lifeblood of British commerce. They also knew that the destination for that specie lay at the end of the English Channel, and, quite specifically, in the port of London itself. It was thus no surprise that every enemy privateer's dream was to take a vessel carrying such large sums of an easily tradable commodity. It was also no surprise that the agents of those London merchants and bankers were disinclined to ship their money in vulnerable vessels. Thus a trade had evolved in which King George's warships, frequently passing in wartime between the Mediterranean or the East Indies en route home, would call in at Lisbon to pick up cargoes of gold and silver. To utterly avoid risk in trafficking such money was impossible, but a well-armed Royal Navy vessel was better than any poorly armed and manned merchantman, and it was well worth the bullion trader's while to pay naval captains 1% of the value of what they carried. A tempting reward, which had, over time, come to be seen as almost a right. John Pearce was no stranger to the avarice of naval officers. If there was one topic to excite a conversation in even the dullest wardroom, it was the possibility that the men there might be lucky enough to partake in the capture of a Spanish plate ship, deeply laden with precious metals and jewels, coming from the Caribbean to Cadiz. The blockade of that port was one of the greatest plums in the gift of the Admiralty, especially for those frigate captains tasked to set a screen out at sea to alert their heavier counterparts to incoming vessels. The sight of a fleet of Spanish galleons, at a time when the two nations were at war, was the dream of every naval officer. They might talk of glory in battle with enthusiasm, of forcing an enemy combatant to strike and receiving the thanks of the nation, but deep down the prospect of limitless wealth was the greater draw, the kind of prize taken that would set up even a lieutenant for life, and make a ship's captain not just a fellow of independent means, but a person of real substance. If the dream fulfilled was a rarity, a fee of 1% of several £1,000s was not to be sniffed at. So HMS Grampus was soon at anchor off the city of Lisbon, with Captain Dawes having himself rowed ashore, this time with strict instructions that neither women, traders, or entertainers should be allowed aboard, given the time it always took to clear any vessel of their presence. Indeed, there was one other boat making for the shore, carrying, despite their protests, several women who had come aboard at Gibraltar and managed to conceal themselves from the master-at-arms, his mates, and the marines whose task it was to clear the ship. The excuses for stopping at Lisbon were varied and well worn, but delay was anathema to the men who ran the navy. Dawes came back aboard in a patently obvious fury, and, as always, the reason for his anger spread through the ship with remarkable speed. A frigate, HMS Fury, on her way back from Calcutta, sailing alone instead of escorting a convoy, had been in the week before and scooped the Pool. She had weighed for home with near £500,000 in bullion tucked safe in her captain's cabin, and since no more specie had come in from South America, Dawes was obliged to depart Lisbon empty-handed. That there was no sympathy for him was natural, and that extended from the meanest swabber to the Premier. Captains were not obliged to share their 1%, and thus rarely did so. So it was back to deep water, and a course set north, and with no land in sight the ship settled into the familiar routine. The decks were cleaned, swabbed, and flogged dry every morning before the hands were sent to breakfast. The various tasks detailed by the Premier carried out, following that meal, on sails and rigging, interrupted by slight adjustments to the sail plan. Then came the piping of the hands to dinner, at which point Pearce was obliged, as he too ate in the wardroom, to endure the way conversation flowed around, but did not include him, something he accepted with annoying equanimity, though occasionally he was tempted to speak when one of their number mouthed some patent absurdity. As soon as he had consumed his food, he made his way to the deck, thus relieving them of his presence and his own ears of their dull conversation.
End of CD 5.